Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of the Buckingham Public Lectures in the Humanities for 2015. I'm John Adamson, the Director of the University's Humanities Research Institute, which presents this series of lectures, and whose honour it is to introduce this evening's lecturer. I will turn to our speaker in a moment. First, however, the briefest of words about the lecture series. These Buckingham Public Lectures provide a platform for scholars engaged in some of the most interesting research currently being undertaken in the field of the humanities to present their findings to a wider public than universities usually make possible. As such, they provide a natural complement to the university's series of London-based master's programs in the humanities, whose seminar programs continue to attract some of the most eminent figures in academia and public life. It's an all-star cast, and you will find some of the great minds listed somewhat boastfully in the banners that you will find immediately outside the door as you leave. If you would like to be notified of future lectures, or to receive further information about the university's London-based master's programs, please fill in your email address on the back of the program card and leave it at the reception desk as you leave. But to this evening's lecturer. Christopher Clarke is one of the most distinguished contemporary historians writing in English, or perhaps in any other language. Educated in Sydney, the Freie Universität Berlin, and Cambridge, Clarke is one of those rare historians who've not only changed our understanding of great events, but who, in the case of Germany, have changed an entire nation's understanding of who it is and where it has come from. It's a measure of how highly he is esteemed in Germany that we're honoured this evening to have the presence of the German ambassador, and I greatly welcome him and Mr. Hyman to the lecture this evening. Clarke's work has been characterized by powerful and effective challenges to well-entrenched but ultimately facile notions of historical causation that, as he has shown, owe less to genuine forms of historical understanding than they do to the morally dubious game of attributing blame and guilt. He's written widely and voluminously, so let me just take two examples. His magnificent history of Prussia, published in 2006, ranging across 3.5 centuries from 1600 to 1947, effectively demolished the myth of the so-called distinctiveness of Prussia's historical experience, that supposedly peculiar propensity to despotism and militarism that made Prussia the progenitor, or so it was alleged, of Germany's 20th century catastrophes. Similarly, his 2012 book, The Sleepwalkers, his groundbreaking study of the immediate origins of the First World War, has changed fundamentally our understanding of how one of the greatest calamities in European history came about. Clarke's mastery of the archives in a dozen European languages and a sort of Olympian clarity in viewing the labyrinths of pre-war diplomacy from London to St. Petersburg has laid bare the systemic follies of the pre-1914 European system. Its tendency towards reckless diplomatic risk-taking, its quixotic nationalism, the propensity to send misleading signals and to misread those that were coming in from outside. All these characterized the behaviors of almost every European government in the decade before the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Responsibility for that tragedy, as Professor Clarke has persuasively argued, has ultimately to be shared collectively as a European responsibility, not arbitrarily to be laid at the door of those who lost. His work, unsurprisingly, has been garlanded with prizes. Among them, the Wolfson Prize in Britain, the still more prestigious German Historians Prize, awarded every 3 years, and more recently, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for The Sleepwalkers, not to mention the Officer's Cross of the German Order of Merit. Though it was left to a reviewer in the London Daily Telegraph to offer my favourite accolade, which has a quixotic nationalism all its own. Apparently unaware that Professor Clarke is an Australian citizen, the reviewer noted that his books have gone where German historians have feared to tread, allowing his review to conclude triumphantly, thus it was left to an Englishman to write what is surely the best history of Russia in any language. At least in history, that sort of Little Englander-ism is no longer possible, and it's to a large extent the work of this evening's lecturer that has made it so. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to welcome Professor Clarke.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking John Adamson for those extremely kind and generous words of introduction, and also thanking the Humanities Research Institute at Buckingham University for inviting me to speak to you this evening, and of course thanking you all for coming along tonight, although I know there are plenty of other interesting things to do in a city like London. I should add, by the way, that although I, of course, am Australian and intend to remain so, I am also British. But it is also the case that one cannot become an Englishman. There is no means of doing that. One can only become British. So after if devolution goes any further, then perhaps some kind of mechanism will have to be found. But it hasn't been yet. In any case, yes, I wanted to open really by revisiting the events of the 28th of June 1914. Because it seems to me that although the narrative of what happened on that day will be familiar to a lot of you, perhaps to all of you, nevertheless the events of that day have a kind of specific gravity and a density which rewards revisiting them. And so I want to start with what I think a couple, a married couple, who I think it's fair to say are about to have a very bad day. He is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the Austrian throne, the Austro-Hungarian throne. She is Sophie Chotek, the Duchess of Hornberg, his wife, the heir to a very distinguished Bohemian lineage, not distinguished enough for the royals of the Habsburg house, who regarded her as not sufficiently aristocratic to be allowed, for example, to participate in alongside her husband in royal occasions. She wasn't allowed, for example, to ride in the royal carriage with its golden wheels alongside him. That is one reason why she insisted in Sarajevo, a relatively peripheral location in this sprawling empire, on spending the day beside her husband in his open car, because in this relatively peripheral location, on the sort of oriental fringes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was possible to do things that in Vienna were simply not allowed by the masters of protocol who presided over court etiquette. This is a picture taken from the actual day of the assassination. This is the arrival in the morning of the Archduke and his entourage in front of Sarajevo railway station. I want to draw your attention simply to the garish ostrich feathers. They are green. You can't tell that because this is a black and white photograph. You'll just have to take my word for it. But they were beautiful garish green ostrich feathers. I'll be coming back to them in a moment. And of course, looking around, all they can see is smiling faces. That's not very surprising because every face is an Austrian one in that picture. This is a map of the Balkans. I think that when one's in Britain, or in fact anywhere in the world, except in the Balkans, one can never look often enough at the Balkans, at the map of the Balkans. Again, this is one of those things that's so complex, one's constantly forgetting where everything is. I once made this point when I was giving a talk about this problem in the city of Zagreb, the capital city of Croatia, and I made this comment, and I noticed there were a lot of puzzled faces, and then suddenly I realized we were, of course, in the Balkans, one of the few places where people actually do know where everything is. Certainly in Cambridge, one's forever having to remind everyone where all these countries are. But I've included two maps here because it's a bit like those almost identical images on the back of a cereal packet where you have to identify 10 differences. And I wanted to draw your attention to some. But one comes from 1911, the other from 1914. And you can see a few things are changing, and some of them are very important. The most important is the Ottoman Empire is in swift retreat. It is pulling back helter-skelter across the southeastern periphery of Europe, pulling back to effectively the extent of Turkey today, around Adrianople and Constantinople on the far east of that area of what used to be known as European Turkey, or Turkish Europe. And another important point, of course, Greece and Bulgaria are expanding, but perhaps most important for our story, Serbia is expanding. It expands by more than 100%, it more than doubles its extent and its population, and so acquires an importance in the region that it had not possessed, or not to the same extent, in 1911. Certainly a much greater gravity and importance in the eyes of the policymakers in Vienna, who look on the expansion of Serbia, and in particular on the truly brilliant and swift mobilizations of the Serbian army during the two Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, the two wars which are the reason for the retreat of Ottoman power and for the expansion of Serbia, looking at the extraordinary performance of Serbian arms during those two wars, 1912 and 1913, the swift over-mobilization of the male population. It was a very impressive, and for people in Vienna, for policymakers in Vienna, a very worrying spectacle. And then I wanted to draw your attention to one thing which remains the same between these two images, and that is the location of Belgrade. In fact, in the map on the right that you can see on the screen, Belgrade, due to a printer's error, almost looks as if it's inside Austria-Hungary. It's not, of course, but it is right on the border. It's a few minutes' drive in a horse and carriage or a train to make it back into Austro-Hungarian territory. And when the Austrian envoy, Baron Giesel, left the Austrian embassy in Belgrade after receiving what he regarded as an unsatisfactory reply to the Austrian ultimatum to Belgrade, he was back in Austro-Hungarian territory within a few minutes. And that tells us something about the intimacy of what had become an increasingly toxic relationship. This is a relationship that was close, but also poisoned by mutual prejudices and hatreds on both sides of the border. This is the closest that the early 20th century got to Google Earth. It's an engraving from the Baedeker travel guide to Sarajevo, and it tells us basically, what kind of place Sarajevo is. It's like a cupped hand. Sarajevans will always use this metaphor of the cupped hand. Between the two hands runs the river Miljacka, a very handsome, swift-flowing, clear river, right through the middle of the town. And you can see that the river bisects the city on both sides. It rises fairly fast, steep hills and peaks, dotted with what were then Muslim cemeteries with their short, small white columns of marble, which can be seen from far away. And it's along the banks of that river, along the Appel Quay, moving from left to right, in other words, across towards the east, from the west to the east, towards the Rathaus. It's marked there since this is a German map. Oops, there we go. That's what is that again? What's this one, is it? Oh, there we are. The Rathaus, there it is there. The City Hall. Moving along the river towards the City Hall, that's the route that the cars took, the 5 cars, the second of which was occupied by Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. Now, I like this diagram because it relates with such brutal simplicity the events of that day. As the cars are passing the Shumoria Bridge, and a young man, a Serbian national, he's actually a citizen or a subject of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he's a Serbian, an ethnic Serb, Serb speaker, a young man called Nedjeljko Čabrinović, throws a bomb or grenade with a chemical fuse. He has to break the detonator first. Breaking the detonator itself makes a loud report. So when this bang was heard, the driver of the second car, thinking that either a tire had blown or that a gun had been fired, applied some pressure to the accelerator. And for that reason, the car sped up slightly, and the bomb didn't land in the car, which was where Čabrinović intended it to go, in which case it would have killed Sophie Kortek, the Duchess of Hornberg, Franz Ferdinand himself, and the hated governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Governor Potiorek. It would have killed them all. Instead, it hit the back of the car, the sort of soft awning which is folded at the back of this open sports coupe, and landed on the road, and then exploded under the third car, where it wounded everybody inside, but didn't kill anyone. Now, you might have thought, once this bomb had gone off, that it was time to call off the visit to Sarajevo. And in fact, this idea was broached with their Highnesses. It was suggested to Franz Ferdinand that, things are not going well, Your Highness, I think we should now leave the city. And he said, don't be ridiculous, the man is clearly insane, have him taken to an asylum. Meanwhile, by the way, Čabrinović had leapt into the river Miljacka, hoping to be swept away by the flood, but as it had been a very hot and dry summer, it was only about 3 feet deep. So he stood there and then loyally tried to take his poison, potassium cyanide, which he had with him, failed to do that because he was very quickly apprehended by a few standers-by, including a figure that one, I think, could probably only find in the pre-First World War Austro-Hungarian Empire, namely a barber, this is as it's stated in the protocols, a barber armed with a pistol. While he was being carried off to the police, this argument was being had with Franz Ferdinand, who insisted on going on. He didn't like being given advice by anybody. He was suffering from a syndrome for which the technical term is grumpy old man. It's something that happens to a lot of us as we get older. We get irritated more and more by less and less, and of course having a bomb thrown into your car is not a small complication. In any case, he remained in the car, and so did she, and they drove off. The other cars picked their way around the stricken hulk of car number 3, and they made their way all the way to the City Hall. And here we see a picture of the City Hall, or that's to say, of the couple leaving the City Hall to get back into their car. I wanted just to stay with this photo for a moment because I think it's interesting. It tells us something about the Muslim character of this town. This was one of the great centers of European Muslim civilization. Many ancient Ottoman and Muslim institutions survived in the city. A Muslim urban life survived there in a sense which had become impossible in the rest of the Balkans, because the emergent Christian nation-states of the Balkans had swept away, deported, in part also sort of bullied and killed their Muslim populations, as a consequence of which you didn't have cities like Sarajevo anywhere in the rest of the peninsula. But under the protection, as it were, of the Habsburgs, this Muslim urban civilization continued to thrive, and the machinery of city government in Sarajevo, must be said, was very Muslim. Its mayor was a Muslim, a man called Mehmet Čorčić. It was to him that fell the unenviable task of welcoming the couple with a speech that he had prepared or had written for him in the previous few days. He was a nervous man at the best of times. He hated giving public speeches, so he was already very nervous and trembling when the report of the bomb was heard. He was informed of what had happened, and of course you can imagine he became even more terrified. The couple arrived in front of the Rathaus. It was time for the speeches to be given, but Mehmet Čorčić's speech was now completely inadequate to the situation, though he was too nervous to change it, because it opened with the words, "It is with sentiments of the deepest joy that the population of this city welcome your highnesses to Sarajevo." He got halfway through this sentence when he was interrupted by Franz Ferdinand, who said, "Deepest joy, welcome. Is this how you express your welcome?" This is Mr. Grumpy speaking. "With thrown bombs," upon which he was interrupted by his wife, who was seen to whisper something in his ear. History does not divulge what exactly she said, but we can assume it was something along the lines of, there, dear, let him be, it's not his fault, let him carry on. There are moments like this in every marriage. So Franz Ferdinand said, "Very well, continue." And he continued with his speech. Franz Ferdinand gave one of his own, and there was a bit of a problem there as well, because it turned out that the speech had been carried in the pocket of his adjutant, who was among those who had been wounded in the car behind, car number 3, and so it was covered in blood. So regular wiping was required in order for him to be able to read his text, which he then did, and it included a few sentences in Serbo-Croat at the end of Serbian or Croatian, which of course is something he liked to do, to include a paragraph in the local language. The speeches being over, there was chit-chat with various local dignitaries. She went off to chat with some Muslim ladies upstairs so that they could take their veils off with no men present. And they talked, and he talked with the dignitaries downstairs. Then they ascended to the balcony at the front of the town hall, and they took one last look out over the city, and then they came down. You can see them here getting into the car. And what happened next, of course, you all know. That's a very fanciful representation of the events that transpired a few minutes later. You probably all know that someone the decision had been made not to take the same route back out of the city, but to go back down the Apel Key along the river Miljacka, in other words, to trace back along the Red Line past the Trumunia Bridge, but someone forgot to inform the Czech driver of the first and Czech drivers, the first and second cars. The decision was made in German in front of these men. It was assumed they'd understood. They hadn't. And when the second car turned into Franz Josef Street, into the Bazaar district, which was felt to be dangerous because these were narrow streets where, in the event that there were further assassins, it would be easy to take cover, the bodyguard, Count Harrach, screamed at the driver, "You idiot." He actually used stronger language than that. He said, "You idiot, we're supposed to be going back down the quay. get into reverse. And at this point, the car stopped, and it was while it was at a complete standstill that the young Soviet nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, was able to take his shots. Virtually nothing about this picture is sort of faithful to the reality, except the fact that the shots are being fired from almost point-blank range. In fact, the car was going in the other direction, that's to say he was on the other side of the car, and of course the victims did not stand up like figures in an opera. It looks as if she's singing "I die" or something like that. In fact, nothing like that happened. They remained completely immobile. In fact, it wasn't clear that they'd been shot at all, or at least hit at all. They'd been shot at, but it wasn't clear that they'd been hit. Count Havak recalled in his deposition to the Austrian court, the trial that was convened in order to try the assassins. He deposited in his speech that he had initially thought that the bullets must have missed because the two were sitting exactly where they had been before, and as the car pulled back, it was only as it roared back off down the Appel Quay that she teetered sideways onto his lap, and it was at that point that he could be heard saying to her these words, which later became extremely famous within 24 hours. In fact, they became famous throughout the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and indeed across the world, namely Zofal, Zofal, sterbe nicht, stirbt nicht. Zofal soll sterbe nicht, bleib am Leben für unsere Kinder. Sophie, Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children. And these, the mediatic sort of transmission of these words right across the world, in particular across Austria-Hungary, is important because this had not been a popular man. He was not JFK. People didn't fall to their knees weeping when they heard that he died. He was unpopular. He was regarded as excessively clerical, reactionary in his politics. But what resulted from his death was an opening up of the private man who had been unknown to the broader public, in particular through these words, but also through numerous anecdotes that appeared in the press over the next 24 hours about the tender relationship between him and his wife, about their unusually close relationship with their children, the great care they took over their children, the hours he spent playing with them, all this kind of thing turned him into a human. I mean, the comment, I think, of Karl Koss, the great wit and satirist and journalist of pre-1914 Vienna, is very apt. He remarked in an essay published in that week, the first week after the assassinations, he said, "What remained silent in the life of the Archduke became eloquent through his death." And that's important, I think, because although this wave of emotion that swept Austria-Hungary helps us to explain the very swift and rather radical response to these assassinations may have been in part media-generated, it was nonetheless authentic. We're all, I think, modern enough nowadays to understand that emotions can be powerful, even when they are generated by the media. This is a photograph that I think is interesting. It has often been captioned as the photograph of Gavrilo Princip's arrest. Now, if someone had managed, given the state of photographic technology of 1914, to capture the moment of his arrest sort of by accident, then that really would be a miracle. In fact, it's not the arrest of Gavrilo Princip at all. It's the arrest of another man, a suspect, a couple of days later by the name of Fedor Beer, and the photographer has obviously been pre-warned by the police that the arrest is going to take place. And the photographer truly took the picture, and then he had a brilliant idea. Why not capture in the picture the arrest of the assassin? Which he did, and he made a fortune out of the syndication of this picture. Now that's the last time a journalist has ever behaved like that. In any case, although this photograph is not quite telling us what it purports to be telling us, or what it is sometimes purported to be telling us, it is telling us something, namely something about the climate in those first days after the assassination, because you can see this man is not just being arrested, he's also being protected. He's being protected against local Muslims who are trying to attack him, to beat him, and that's because the mood of the Muslim population was very much roused against the Serbian minority in the city, the large Serbian minority in the city. This is a picture of the assassin himself, Gavrilo Princip, one of the 7 young boys who gathered, they were all very young, who gathered in the city of Sarajevo that day to carry out the assassination. There he is, and he doesn't look very well. He's thin, underweight, a bit sallow-faced, and that's because he was indeed quite ill by the time he carried out this act. He was suffering from tuberculosis, of which he eventually died in Theresienstadt fortress during the war itself. And I mean, a couple of the other boys were not very well either, but he was definitely the illest of them. And the judge, the interrogating judge, Leo Pfeffer, when he recalled he's the man who asked him what had happened and why he'd done what he'd done, and tried to find out the background to the plot, and actually teased quite a lot of information out of him, without parading him around in orange pajamas, or putting him in manacles, or confronting him with witnesses, or humiliating or tormenting him in any other way. He managed to tease information out of him, because they all gave contradictory evidence, and this was all exploited, but in a fairly easygoing and gentle way by today's standards. Nevertheless, he remarked in his recollections of his meetings with Gavrilo Princip that he said it was impossible to believe that such a frail and fine-looking creature could have carried out such an abominable act. And Leo Pfeffer himself was to die in Theresienstadt, though not in the fortress of Theresienstadt, in Theresienstadt a couple of decades later, when it had become one of the key loci of the Holocaust. That's because he was in fact of Jewish descent, and so he perished in a later catastrophe. One of the many sort of twisted ironies of this story. There's an image of four of the other conspirators: Trubilovich, Chabrinovich, Ilich, and Grabesh. And there's the man who helped to coordinate this assassination, a man by the name of Dragutin Dmitrievich, the chief of Serbian military intelligence, known to history by his nickname, Apis, partly because I suppose most people find that easier to pronounce. And you can see the picture on the right, which shows Apis on the rightmost figure. I mean, they look like they're conspiring, and this is a very posed picture. Apis regarded himself as a conspirator, he regarded himself as a patriot. He was a patriot. He was a man who had dedicated himself entirely to the greater Serbian ideal. He was a person of very pure and focused life. And indeed, it must be said of all the young men involved in the assassinations, that they weren't terrorists in the sense that we would use the term today. They were not people who rejoiced in indiscriminate carnage. Gavrilo Princip did not even intend to kill Sofia Kotek. His second bullet was actually aimed at Governor Potyorek, whom he saw as a carrier of state power. So the violence was supposed to be focused on the agents of state power. It wasn't supposed to be the kind of indiscriminate carnage we see wrought by terrorists today. And that's an important distinction, I think one needs to make. There are freedom fighters and patriots, but not necessarily terrorists. Or one could call them perhaps state terrorists. And there is the man who was in charge of managing the difficult fortunes of the Serbian state during the extraordinarily tumultuous and fast-moving month of events that followed the assassinations. A man, I think, of extraordinary shrewdness and intelligence, a kind of Serbian Bismarck, a man by the name of Nikola Pasic. Just a couple of words on Pasic before I move on to just talk more generally about the problem of the inception of this war. Pasic was not in any sense of the words behind the assassinations at Sarajevo. He had not planned them, he did not condone them, he did not approve this kind of activity. He had even tried during the previous few weeks to interdict and shut down the cross-border activities, the terrorist activities, you could call them, of Apis, of Dragutin Dmitrievich and his network, the Black Hand. He tried to shut that down, but with no success. On the other hand, he did have foreknowledge of the assassinations. He knew that young men and weapons had crossed the border during May. He was rather slow to respond. There are very good reasons why he found it difficult to know what to do in the face of this irredentist activity. In all likelihood, he hoped that the attempt would fail, and that he would sort of, the storm would, there would be no storm, he would avoid the crisis which he must have known would be the result if it succeeded. Okay, so just coming now to the more general question of how one makes sense of the inception of this war, I wanted really to begin this part of my talk by reminding you of something you all know already, which is that on the morning of the day when this couple came to Sarajevo, the morning of 28th of June 1914, Europe was still at peace. And indeed, if you had asked any one of the best informed statesmen of the continent on that morning whether they thought that a major European conflagration was likely or imminent, then they would all have told you that a major war, a war of European scale, had become, if anything, less likely rather than more likely in recent times. After all, Europe had got through the two Balkan wars, wars in this turbulent region, without there being a general conflagration. And Margaret Macmillan has written, I think, very eloquently in her book on the outbreak of the First World War, the war that ended peace, about the sort of drumbeat of crises before 1914. And she says these crises had a paradoxical effect. As they succeeded each other, one after another, of course, subsiding as crises always do, creating anxieties and fears and then ebbing away, that this had a numbing effect on contemporaries, that this, as it were, lessened or diminished their sense of danger rather than increasing it, as it perhaps ought to have. And we have the eloquent testimony of Sir Arthur Nicholson, a senior functionary in the British Foreign Office in London, who comments at the end of May 1914 in a letter to a colleague. He says, in all the years since I have been at the Foreign Office, I have never seen such calm international waters. That's the end of May 1914. And yet, of course, only 37 days after that visit to Sarajevo and after the assassination of the couple, Europe was indeed at war. And out of this European war would unfold a world war which I think has rightly been called, though the term is somewhat tired now, it's been so overused during 2014, which has rightly been called the Urkatastrophe, the primal catastrophe. It's George F. Kennan's word initially, but it's become very widely used in the German context as well by German historians, a primal catastrophe. The term has been criticized because this war is clearly not a primal catastrophe for everyone. It wasn't a primal catastrophe for the Poles. For the Poles, it's a painful rebirth of the nation state. I wouldn't really even say it's a primal catastrophe for the Australians. I mean, there are high mortalities, but every man who dies with the AIF is a volunteer. The Australians went there of their own free will, and they died as volunteers. They weren't conscripted. No Australians were shot for desertion during the First World War, so I wouldn't really call it a primal catastrophe. For the Australians too, it's a kind of blood, a baptism of blood, and that sort of language was widely used in the Australian press during and after this war. It was a kind of coming of age of a relatively new nation, which had only been confederated from a loose assemblage of independent colonies, well, not independent, but different colonies governed separately from London. It had only been confederated in 1901. So this war was the first great act of national independence, and I think it has to be seen as a sort of moment of birth and emergence rather than as a primal catastrophe. But if you think in larger terms of the amount of poison released by this war into the world's system, then I think it is hard to get away from this idea that it was a kind of primary catastrophe. As Fritz Stern, the German emigre and American historian, fine historian, commented, this is the disaster from which all the disasters of the 20th century sprang, and I think he's absolutely right about that. It's hard to imagine the rise of fascism in Italy without the impact of the First World War. It's hard to imagine the October Revolution in the Russian Empire. It's very easy to imagine something like the February Revolution, a collapse of Tsarism, a seizure of power by a sort of middling constellation of groups and interests from the Duma, possibly some non-parliamentary groups as well. Virtually everyone had predicted the collapse of Tsarist authority in something like the February Revolution. No one had predicted the coup-like structure, the coup-like events of October 1917 in Russia, and the creation thereafter of a state, of a one-party state, absolutely without precedent in world history. And of course, it's hard to imagine German history taking its trajectory into the darkness of 1933 to 1945, the seizure of power by the National Socialist movement, the Holocaust. It's hard to imagine all of that without the extraordinary stresses and strains of this war. So I think that my former colleague now at Yale, soon to move to Columbia, Adam Tooze, is right when he speaks in his new book about the impact of this war, a book called Deluge, when he speaks of the unhinging of the world political system by this war. It's not just that that 4 empires were swallowed up, or that 20 million young men were killed, or that a further 21 million were wounded. It's also that the world, the global system, was disorganized in ways which continued to bedevil world politics right throughout the 20th century. In fact, if we look at the Middle East, in some respects they continue to do so today. So it follows from all this, I think, that the question of how this war came about has a certain intrinsic difference, a certain intrinsic interest. And I don't want to disappoint you this evening, but I'm not the first person to have noticed this. This is not a new debate. There's a very interesting book which came out with Oxford University Press. That's the last time this evening I'll use the word Oxford. In 1991, by John W. Langdon, called The Long Debate. And the title is effectively the thesis of the book, but he makes the point that if you really want to understand the outbreak of the First World War, then you must read 25,000 books and articles in English alone. Rebecca West, the British author and and thinker who went to the Balkans in the 1930s in order to write this extraordinary book, Black Lamb, Great Falcon, one of the deepest reflections, I think, on the place of the Balkans in 20th century European history. When she went to Sarajevo in 1937 to see some of the places where this war had its beginnings, she ascended the stairs to the balcony on the first floor of the city hall in Sarajevo with her husband, her then husband Paul, and they stood on this balcony and looked out from exactly the position that Franz Ferdinand and Zofia Kotek had done shortly before they went back to their car. And she turned to her husband and she said, "You know, I shall never understand how it all happened. It's not that we know too little, it's that we know too much." And that was in the year 1937, and of course today we know a hell of a lot more. So the question arises, why add another book to the Cheops pyramid of paper that already exists? And as you can imagine, my colleagues in Cambridge were quick to pose this question as they struggled with this book. Surely this has been done to death. I remember one colleague in my own college, incidentally, saying to me, "This has been done to death, what's the point?" That's a sort of gift that one's academic colleagues have, that just as one's struggling with the complexities of a really cruel subject, they come up with excellent reasons why one should just curl up and die. Well, the answer, of course, is that one has to find an answer to such taunts, and the answer that I found is that of course, yes, the debate is old. It would be crazy to deny that, but the subject is still fresh. Indeed, in some ways, the subject matter at the core of this long debate is fresher than it was 20, 30, or 40 years ago. Let me see if I can make it clear what I mean by that. But in the 1970s, when, as a schoolboy in Sydney, at Sydney Grammar School, I first encountered this problem, the problem of how the First World War broke out, the problem of why, the problem of the war's origins, a great deal of period drama, of period charm had sort of accumulated around what was still called Europe's last summer. There was a lot of tennis and gin and tonics, and there were gaudy uniforms. If you read Barbara Tuchman's two wonderful books, The Proud Tower and The Guns of August, which I wholeheartedly recommend to everyone in this room, they are still brilliant reading. And they're still actually quite really very sophisticated pieces of historical reflection, although they're also beautifully written. There's no paradox there. But in any case, if one read, though of course some colleagues again there is, but we'll leave that to one side. But there, if one read that book, one was struck by the loving descriptions of uniforms, of garish uniforms, there's a marvellous account of Lord Salisbury making his way to the House of Commons on a tricycle which he himself had built. A tricycle on pneumatic wheels, pneumatically tired wheels. The first one in all of London, being pushed through St James Park by his valet. He had to be pushed because it hadn't occurred to him to put pedals on this thing. As one read the details of the sumptuous menus at gala dinners and the detailed requirements about where exactly babies could be presented in their prams at the Habsburg court, as one sort of surveyed all what David Cannadine would call the ornamentalism of this world, the assumption stealthily asserted itself that if these people had green ostrich feathers on their helmets, then they must have had green ostrich feathers on their thoughts and ideas and dreams as well. They must have been bygone people of a bygone era, people of a moribund age, who had nothing to tell us, nothing that could possibly be of any relevance or interest to our own time. But if you look again at the events of 1914, and not from the perspective of the 1970s, but from the perspective of the not quite beginning 21st century, where we all stand in this room, or sit, as the case may be, then you can't help but be struck by the raw modernity, contemporaneity of these events. They start with a cavalcade of automobiles, right? There are no horses to be seen. It's all automobiles. And if you run through the events that occurred that day on the Apalpio beside the Mediatska River, you can't help but have flickering at the back of your head the films of November 1963 in Dallas. There are bodyguards, for example, standing on the running boards. The events start with a squad of suicide bombers. And I use that term advisedly because these young men were not just carrying guns and bombs, though they're also carrying those, of course. They're also carrying phials of potassium cyanide, which they've been instructed to take after carrying out their missions. And in fact, the two most active commandos in the group, Nedjelko Čabrinović and Gavrilo Princip, both tried to take their poison. Čabrinović tried to take his in the river, as I mentioned before. Princip tried to take his after making his two shots. They both managed to ingest some poison, but the poison was of poor quality. It had probably been badly mixed in the first place. It had gone off. All it did was burn the surfaces of their throats and stomachs, making them retch and vomit in Chabinowski's case. So they weren't in very good shape by the time they got to the police station, but they were still alive. They weren't supposed to survive, but actually they tried to take their own lives. And indeed the movement that they represented, the movement of the Black Hand, Chudna Ruka, or also known as Union or Death, or Jednenie ili Smrt, that movement was a movement not exactly obsessed, but moved by a kind of cult of death, self-sacrifice, revenge, and assassination, for which of course there are obvious contemporary parallels, which I don't need to go into. And I think our compass has shifted in other ways as well, ways that bring these events closer to us. One is, of course, in the 1990s, the Yugoslav wars reminded us of the continuing energy of Balkan nationalism, its power to move events, so that it becomes less obvious. This is a point really worth making, because in a great deal of the literature on the origins of the First World War, the Balkans are scarcely visible. They've been airbrushed from the scene. They're just the setting. And the language of pretext is used. The assassinations weren't that important, they were just a pretext for plans that were already long prepared, and so on. The Balkans is kind of rendered irrelevant. Well, it seems to me that's a less obvious strategy once we remind ourselves of the power of Balkan nationalism and the power of geopolitics in the Balkans to move events in the region and beyond. And then there's the fact, I suppose, that the horrific carnage of 9/11 reminded us of the power of an event, a terrorist event, an event freighted with symbolic significance, where the targets had been very carefully chosen. Now, I don't want to make any kind of crass comparison or assert any kind of crass equivalence between the carnage of 9/11 and the murder of two people, two politically prominent individuals on a street in Sarajevo in 1914. But what I want to draw your attention to is the power of an event to change the chemistry of politics, the chemistry of the international environment. And that's a point, again, worth making, because among historians, there was a time when the event, as an analytical category, fell out of favor. It became unfashionable to talk about events. There was a time when everybody felt obliged to quote the wonderful words of Fernand Braudel, one of the greatest historians, but this was an unfortunate formulation, I think, when he remarked that events were the soft, contemptible foam that rides on the great waves of structural history, and that intelligent historians ought to look at structures in the long-term life of structures, and not at the sort of irrelevant fripperies and distractions of mere events. But I think that's a mistake. I think that events can be hard. They don't have to be soft and malleable. They can be very hard, and structures can be soft. And sometimes events can transform structures, just as structures help us to understand events. And finally, there's the fact that we've reached the end of that era of, well, I mean, this is a point that's been made a million times since 1989. We've reached the end of that era of bipolar stability that we call the Cold War. We've reached, in fact, the end of the post-Cold War. According to George Friedman, the Cold War was followed by the post-Cold War, which is a period of unipolar dominance by Washington. If you recall that phrase, which resonated in the years between 1989 and about 2006-07, full spectrum dominance. Well, we don't hear those words anymore. Now we're in what Friedman calls the post-Cold War. It's not a unipolar, it's not elegant, I know, we can't come up with anything better. But in any case, I don't know what we'll do with the next era. How many posts can you line up? But anyway, we're now in an era of genuine multipolarity, a world characterized by rising powers, by not exactly a declining world empire, but a weary titan. A titan wearying of its world role, and there are many, many signs of its doing that. And this is the language that was used about Britain in 1914. It's often used about Washington today. And these shifts in perspective mean that 1914, paradoxically, even as it pulls away from us in calendar time, is in some respects coming closer to us, speaking to us more urgently than perhaps it did 20, 30 or 40 years ago. And these shifts in perspective prompt us also to rethink the story of how war came to Europe. Accepting that challenge emphatically does not mean embracing a vulgar presentism, where we remake the past to suit or to fit the needs or preferences of the present. Rather, it means acknowledging those features of the past of which our changed vantage point affords us a better view, there are things we can see better and more clearly than our predecessors could. And recognizing those things does not mean sweeping away everything that our predecessors understood and learned to understand about 1914. The vastness of this literature has to be taken seriously. There's a great deal of understanding, of deep reflection in that literature. And it's absolutely pointless to go gallivanting about in the name of a sort of one-sided revisionism and offering a new gospel of 1914. You have to work additively and integrate into that the already existing, very sophisticated already existing understanding of this crisis, the various elements of new insight that we can generate from our standpoint. Okay, so bearing all of this in mind, how does one go about trying to review or refresh the narrative? How do you develop a distinctive approach to a question like this one, a question on which so many distinguished brains have already brooded? Well, my own effort to do this falls, I think, into 3 or 4 categories, and I'd like to say just a few words about each in turn and then finish off. The first is that I thought it might be a good idea to rather than fixing in advance on a different answer, try to think, hey, maybe I could answer the question of the origins of the First World War differently by, I don't know, blaming another country, or something like that. Rather than trying to find a different answer, it occurred to me that it might be more fruitful to, I mean, it's obvious that if historians do decide on their answer before they begin research, they never admit to. And of course, that's not how we're supposed to proceed. But in any case, it seemed to me that it might be better or more fruitful to ask a different question. In other words, instead of asking why did this war come about, which is the question at the heart of the origins literature, rather to ask the question of how it came about. Now, it might seem that questions of why and how are sort of interlocked. They can't really be separated. They're sort of connected at the roots, like Heathcliff and Catharine. You can't really pull them entirely apart. But nevertheless, they lead us in different directions. Questions about why lead us in the direction of remote causes, of abstractions, abstract causes. So when we ask the question why, sooner or later we'll be talking about the rise of nationalism, imperialism, we'll be talking about armaments, stockpiling of armaments, about the spread of social Darwinism as a way of thinking about managing international relationships, and so on. And as we trawl the decades before 1914, a lot of these sort of why-oriented studies go back to 1870, the formation of the German Empire. As we trawl the decades before 1914 for causes and we pile them up, then an optical illusion sets in. Namely, that as we pile these causes on top of each other, the scale begins to tilt from a possible war to a probable war to an inevitable war. And the more causation, the more of this illusion of a steadily growing pressure of causation we create through the quest for causes, the more we squeeze out of the field of vision the agency of those men whose decisions brought this war into the world. Because a war is not a volcanic eruption. It is not a natural event like a tornado. It is an event, it is a political event, which means it's an event brought about by decisions. It has to be chosen. And so the question how was partly motivated by an effort to try and give some oxygen, some breathing space to those decisions that brought this war about. Another reason for choosing and of course one of the most interesting trends in recent writing on this war has been to get away from the idea of an inevitable war. And I'm thinking here of the Leeds historian Holger Afflerbach's wonderful book, Improbable War. He in fact co-edited with David Stevenson of the LSE, and it's a very interesting volume, and there's a wonderful introductory essay by the two of them in which they unfold a set of arguments about how this war was in some respects becoming less likely before it became more likely. There is no, if you drew the sort of causal pressure for war on a graph, it would not be a steadily rising line. It would be going up and down in all kinds of paradoxical ways. Another reason for trying to pull away from the why question towards the how was articulated for me in any case by a Bulgarian historian of the Balkan Wars, who comments in the foreword to his book, when we pose, these are his words, when we pose the question why, guilt soon becomes the focal point. In other words, when we ask why, what we often mean is who. Who did this terrible thing? Who brought this war into the world? And there's no denying the deep wish that human beings have to identify a human agent, a responsible human agent, that one, in terms of which one can explain an event, especially an event as terrible as this. And of course, the classic articulation of an analysis of the outbreak of the First World War focused on the quest for a culpable agent, or a set of culpable agents, was Fritz Fischer's sequence of magisterial works published between the 1960s and the early 1970s, which, I'm not going to go into the details of what Fischer said, but a series of works which articulated in an ever more trenchant and extreme way the view that Germany alone had caused the First World War. Now, it's true that Fischer, when he was pressed, always said, well, it's not sole responsibility, but it is primary responsibility. But the fact is that when one reads a book like The War of Illusions by Fritz Fischer, then one finds nothing on the contribution to the outbreak of war of any other power. Fischer was not interested in the other powers. He never investigated their archives. He never read even the printed record collections associated with what the other powers were up to. He was interested only in the German sources. And what he did was to construct an extraordinary sort of sound carpet of statements by German leader writers, by ministerial officials, by the German Kaiser, that's never difficult, and piecing them all together and creating a kind of collective portrait of the mindset of the German elite, a disturbing portrait of an elite swayed by anxiety, by aggression and paranoia, fear about the future, countered and balanced through a very obvious, self-evident psychological mechanism by aggression, by aggressive plans for aggressive thinking, thoughts about preventive war, about expansion to a point where one would be eternally secure, and so on and so forth. What Fischer did not do, in my view, was actually demonstrate that the Germans, that this mindset produced decisions which on their own brought this war about. But in any case, Fischer's was the most influential articulation of a view on this war, which was focused around the idea of a particular culpable state. By contrast, the How approach pulls away from this approach to offer a journey through the events that aims to identify the decisions and developments and phenomena that made war first possible and later brought war about. This does not mean, and I want to emphasize this, excluding questions of responsibility from the picture or avoiding them. In the end, you have to face them. But it means allowing your answers to the why questions to arise from your answers to the how questions, rather than the other way around. So what Fischer did was, he already knew who was responsible. Otherwise, he would have looked at the archives of other states, or had assistants or other scholars, or worked in partnership with other scholars. He knew that it was the Germans, and then he found out how the Germans did this. Well, in my view, it might be better to ask how this war came about, and then start talking about how you partition responsibility. Though in the end, of course, we do have to face that question. So that was one way in which I tried to slightly shift if you like, the frame of reference for on this issue. And another is, of course, that I did exactly what everybody else does. Every historian does this. I tried to pick up trends, new trends in literature that seemed to be promising. There's one, of course, the existence of a great pyramid of books on the subject you're writing on is intimidating, but it also offers opportunities. You can create conversations between colleagues who are working today and colleagues who are writing in the 1950s and 60s. There are all kinds of interesting corners of this literature that have been overlooked or forgotten because they didn't articulate fashionable viewpoints. And you can find also, or let's say recognize and establish all kinds of constellations within that literature which help you to renew the picture. And one of the most interesting developments in the recent writing on this, the outbreak of this war, is, I think, a kind of globalization of the field of vision. Nowadays, there's a tendency, as used to be the case, to tell this story as a sort of domestic European story of how the great powers ganged up against Germany because the Germans had irritated and provoked everybody into forming a sort of alliance against them. That question now looks that way of telling the story now looks increasingly parochial, and there's increasing interest in the China question, the rising importance of China in the 1890s and 1900s. There's a wonderful book on that by Thomas Otte. The importance of inter-imperial rivalries between Britain and Russia. I mean, the fact is that if you asked yourself in 1905, what was really the structuring tension in the world system, it would certainly not have been the relationship between Britain and Germany. It would have been the deep world historical tension between two great world empires, the British and the Russian. And so anxious were the British about Russian power that in the summer of 1914, despite the fact that they had signed in 1907, the British had signed something called the Anglo-Russian Convention in order to partition, if you like, or to create a sort of partition of spheres of interest in Central Asia, in particular in Persia. By 1914, Whitehall is thinking about breaking off, or at least not continuing the relationship with Russia, and instead seeking an understanding with Berlin. And in fact, the private secretary of Sir Edward Grey, the foreign secretary, a man by the name of William Tyrrell, is briefed for this mission to Berlin in the summer of 1914. He's briefed to do this, but then, of course, the events in Sarajevo intervene, and the feeler is never offered. And there are, of course, other ways in which you can refresh the picture. You can develop new patterns of emphasis. You can emphasize features of the problem that have previously been underexposed. And one thing that particularly struck me when I was doing my research for this was the chaotic quality of decision-making in the European great powers. I don't want to go into too much detail on this. It's something which tends to sort of suck you in, and then you lose everyone's attention, and soon you lose your own. But just to give you a couple of examples, in France, for example, during the tenure in office of Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary in London, during the tenure in office of Grey, no fewer than 16 French foreign ministers came and went from office, and 2 of them came and went twice. Now that gives you a sense, which is quite an achievement, that gives you a sense of the sort of rolling door-like structure of the Quai d'Orsay. It's no wonder these people came and went, because they were constantly being shot in the back by their own permanent functionaries, the so-called centrale in Paris. This is something which has been very interestingly explored by John Keegan and by other historians. You know, so these people were coming and going. It was very unclear whom one would be talking to in a few weeks' time when one was dealing with France. If you look at Russia, well, power is constantly rushing around like sort of wild electrons in a sort of field of energy within the Russian system, a hive-like structure in which all kinds of people can wield power over the decision-making process. If you ask the question, who's in charge in 1904, then the answer will be, January 1904, the answer will certainly be the Tsar. But after the debacle of the Russian-Japanese War, if you ask the same question again in 1906, the answer will be the new minister-president, the chairman of the Council of Ministers. Stolypin is the strong man of the hour. He controls everything. We don't hear from the Tsar anymore. He's disappeared. If you ask the same question again in 1908, then the answer would have to be, well, actually, things have changed. The foreign minister is now running the show. Izvolsky has set up a kind of hotline to the Tsar. He's negotiating with the Tsar behind the backs of the other ministers. He's running his own Balkan policy, and so on. That Balkan policy produces the debacle of the Bosnian annexation crisis. And if you ask the same question again in 1910, the answer is once again the minister-president, Stolypin. He's assassinated in 1911, and if you ask the same question in 1912, well, the answer would be, well, the foreign minister's trying to get control of things, but basically the ambassadors are all running their own policies. Speaking of ambassadors, there's the marvelous case of Paul Cambon, the French ambassador in London, who famously remarked to a colleague, when I disagree with the instructions I get from Paris, I burn them immediately. I'm sure that today's ambassadors never behave like this. It was easy to do that in those days, because you had open chimneys in the offices and no smoke alarms. Though, of course, today there are these in email. But in any case, what resulted from all of this was a kind of a Heisenbergian uncertainty about the location of power in all of these apparatuses. Even in Britain, where you had a constitutionally very powerful foreign secretary, in the case of Edward Grey, he had to deal with a constant danger of a sort of peasants' revolt from his own cabinet, because his cabinet did not support his particular reading of Britain's commitments to the entente with France, and by extension to the sort of shadowy relationship between France and Russia. And so Grey himself had constantly to trim his sails, not only to his own understanding of Britain's geopolitical interests, but also to a very vehement liberal radical opposition at home in London. And this also produced unpredictability, what the German contemporaries sometimes called Doppelbödigkeit, a sort of double-flawed quality, a duplicity about British diplomatic signalling, which left them deeply confused about how they could expect the British to react in the event of certain critical developments. And of course that uncertainty was also present in Paris, right up until the events of the summer of 1914, where the French found themselves wondering more and more whether they could actually count on Britain, a development which of course disposed them to count all the more on Russia one of the tragic and paradoxical consequences of the difficulties there that Gray had articulating his position vis-à-vis France was that it forced the French into deepening their commitment, hardening their commitment to Russia's policy, and specifically to Russian policy in the Balkans. But the fact is, I've just used the phrase Russian policy in the Balkans. In a sense, one can't really use that phrase. It's not often clear that there is a single policy. More, it seems that we're dealing with a choir of often dissonant voices with different solutions to the same problems. And of course, this indeterminacy in the power structures generated a kind of radicalizing dynamic. It created opacity, unpredictability, and thereby increased risks. Finally, one last point before I close. There are links in the chain of causes, or the chain of events, that help us to understand this war, that have been, in my view, quite grossly underexposed. One of them is the Italian war on Libya in 1911. It's interesting that exactly 100 years before the airstrikes on Libya in 2011, which themselves are not unimportant developments in view of their subsequent evolution, the Italians attacked Libya with what we now call it Libya. It was then three integral provinces of the old Ottoman Empire, the vilayets of Cyrenaica, Fezzan, and Tripolitania. They attacked completely unprovoked these three provinces, Ottoman provinces in northern Africa, with the hope of, with the intention of making them into, annexing them to an Italian colony. This was an extremely important war, though it's today completely forgotten, even in Italy. There was virtually no commemoration of it in Italy in the year 2011, but it was an important war, not only because, as students of the Maghreb have shown, it's a key moment in the emergence of what we today call pan-Arab nationalism, but also it was also a war rich in atrocities, incidentally, especially on the Italian side, but also because by attacking these three Ottoman provinces in North Africa, the Italians, and in fact the European system, as it were, flashed a green light to the Balkan states to take whatever they could, a sort of sauve-qui-peut, bargain basement assault on the Ottoman Empire was in the offing, and it's very easy to show that the War of 1911 helped to bring about, or actually produced, the war in the following year, the War of 1912, the first of the two Balkan Wars, and thereby destroyed the entire geopolitical structure, the traditional geopolitical structure of the Balkans, forcing Austria-Hungary to improvise, from nothing, a new Balkan policy in a state of panic, something that they were still doing in the summer of 1914 when the assassinations took place. And that context, I think, helps to explain their responses in that year. So that's as much as I want to say, really, by way of, ways in which one can try to set new accents in revisiting this story. But I want to close, really, just by saying that it's very hard, once you walk these paths, to return, once you think in terms of the how, and you trace the decisions, which, as it turns out, took place in many different places. And the Italian attack on Libya had nothing particularly interesting, because it had nothing to do with the Germans and the Austrians. The Italians were not urged by their nominal allies, the Germans and the Austrians, to attack Italy. On the contrary, Berlin and Vienna had repeatedly warned Italy against any adventure of this kind. The two states that encouraged Italy into Africa were Britain and France. As Edward Gray remarked, and one can hardly fault his reasoning, he said the Italians are a great deal more useful to us as members of the opposing alliance than they would be as allies. So the point is that once you walk these paths and look at the decisions and events that made war, that created the mechanisms that then get activated when the crisis of Sarajevo becomes a European conflagration, then it becomes very hard to return to the simplicities, the moral unipolarity of the Fisher thesis, and of its many, the Fisher thesis is a kind of shorthand for a vast sort of terrain of analyses which follow Fisher's lead in one way or another. There's no doubting the appeal of the blame game. Now, by calling it a game, I don't mean to belittle it. This is very serious writing that's been going on around this subject, and Fisher's achievement is still a very important achievement, both in terms of the controversy that he stirred up, which is a crucial sort of, it's like one of these periodic historiographical fevers, which helped to clarify the atmosphere in the Federal Republic of Germany after 1945. So the Fisher controversy is a very important part of contemporary history. But nevertheless, it becomes harder and harder once you look at the complex paths of decisions to return to the unipolarities of a Fisher-style approach. The problem with the blame-oriented approach is not, and I want to emphasize this, that you might end up blaming the wrong party, because frankly it doesn't really matter anymore. It's not a political question in the way it was in the interwar period, when German historians attempted to defend the completely ridiculous thesis that the German state was completely innocent of the events that brought war about, that they were leapt upon like by Russia and France like thieves in the night, the sort of innocentiste thesis of the German historians, of course waging their war of words, as one historian famously called it, the World War, being followed of course by a word war, waging their war of words against the Versailles settlement, the Versailles order. But the political emotion and the political stakes associated with that issue, of course, have largely ebbed away. So the problem is not that you might end up blaming the wrong country or the wrong party. The problem is rather that when you go in search of a culprit, you end up focusing on one state. You identify a suspect, you start collecting beweis material, you act prosecutorially. You have someone in the dock, you're going to prove, or you have someone, let's put it this way, in custody, and you're going to prove that this person did what they did. And the temptation, it doesn't always happen, but the temptation is to focus on one state, leaving to one side, neglecting the complex interactions that that made this war come about. Because the story of how this war came into the world is not a James Bond movie script. It's not a James Bond script. We're not going to find at the end of the story a little coterie of velvet-jacketed villains in front of sort of laboratories full of flashing LEDs, one of them stroking a white cat with a prosthetic hand. It's not an Agatha Christie murder mystery in which we'll find the vicar standing beside the prone corpse of Lady Carrington with a blood-stained short swordfish under his arm. It was an intensely interactive process. It was extremely complex. In fact, it was, in my view, the most complex event of modern times, possibly of all times. It was the fruit of decisions made by a gallery of actors across the European chancelleries, European executive power centres, who shared a fundamentally similar political and a fundamentally European political culture. And it's important, it seems to me, to remember the catastrophe of 1914, and it is about as bad as a catastrophe can be in terms of its consequences. It's important to remember it in its European light, that this was a European disaster, and to think of it in those terms. And it was to illuminate these aspects of the crisis of 1914 that I wrote that book. And I thank you very much for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Clarke has generously agreed to answer questions. We've got about 10 minutes. There's a roving microphone, or 3 roving microphones. Please announce your name and then give your question, please.
My name is Jonathan Hughes. I think you'll be glad to know, I think I've understood what you said. But it seems to me that we have here a perfect storm, a combination of factors, a multitude of factors that led to the outbreak of war. However, to take the counterfactual approach, you could extract any one of those, almost any one of those, and you could say that without that factor, the perfect storm would not have been so perfect. Is there any one factor that you would care to identify as being possibly one that could be withdrawn and therefore the war might not have come about?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, sometimes when we think a bit like those novels by Martin Amis, you imagine going back in time, and you ask yourself the question, who would you have to sort of dispatch in order to prevent the Second World War breaking out? Well, it's a relatively small number of people, you know exactly where to go. I think in 1914, you would have an impossible task on your hand. You'd be dealing with really decision makers right across the continent, and I must say I find it very difficult to find a single factor that one could remove in order to prevent this storm from happening. Is that what you're asking? Whether one could simply take one actor out? I mean, I can think of many, but I cannot think of one whose status is unique in that respect. I mean, for example, if you could imagine a quiescent Serbia that was like Switzerland, then you can't have a Balkan crisis of this kind. If you have a very calm, non-turbulent Balkans, then, which is difficult to imagine because there are good historical reasons why it's turbulent. And it's not turbulent because people there are bad or violent or cruel. It's turbulent for geopolitical reasons that have to do with difficulties created by these long years of Ottoman rule and by the swift withdrawal of Ottoman power. If you imagine the Russians, the Russians might have taken no interest in the Balkans and decided there were certainly Russians arguing that Russia had no business in the Balkans. You have the very eloquent memorandum of Nabor, who writes to a close associate of the Tsar, who writes to him and says, we must not let ourselves get dragged into a Balkan quarrel. It's not just that the Germans will be dragged in if the Austrians get involved. It's also that the war that will follow, it's not just that we'll lose it, everything, old Russia will be swept away entirely. So there are very clear voices warning about the dangers of a certain tendency in decision making. But these voices don't prevail. So you find this readiness to risk a major conflagration. That's the tragedy of 1914, that among the great powers, you find not a will for war, not a desire for war, but a readiness to accept war as the risk attendant upon pursuing one's interests. And that's really where the fatal danger lay, that everybody was willing to accept the risk of a major conflagration in the pursuit of interests which, in the light of the appalling damage wrought by the resulting war, appear pathetically irrelevant.
Professor.
Thank you for the marvelous lecture. My name is Jerry Bradshaw, by the way. Max Hastings, in his recent book, concludes that it's impossible to say any one country was responsible for the Great War. But in his view, you could say that one was more responsible than anyone else, Germany. And he says quite simply this, that a single telephone from Berlin to Vienna in the first week of the war, saying we cannot support you because the Serbians have agreed to everything that you've asked for, would have brought a stop to it. I'd like to hear your comment on that.
Well, thank you very much. Max Hastings and I, to say we disagree would be putting it too well. But I'll leave it, in this gathering I'll leave it at that. But I think that, it's a very interesting counterfactual that you suggest, that the Germans can say to the Austrians, well, you sort this out yourselves, or, we're not interested, and so on. Rather than offering them backing, trying to give them a free hand to act vis-a-vis the Serbs. Now, it's not the case, simply not the case that the Serbs had given the Austrians what they wanted. One of the difficulties that Pašić faced, and that's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about when I wrote this book. Pašić didn't want a war. Serbia was exhausted after these two Balkan wars of 1912 and 1913, though they'd got a lot out of them. They'd also suffered greatly in those two wars, as I said, in all the belligerents, in fact. So he didn't want a war, but nor, on the other hand, was he in any position to give the Austrians satisfaction over in the crisis that followed the assassinations. And this is his personal tragedy, it seems to me. What Pašić ought to have done is, on the morning, or even the afternoon after the assassinations, he should have sent Vienna, this is a counterfactual, right? He could have sent Vienna a list of suspects. He could have said, we've arrested 35 people that we know to be involved in this trafficking activity. We're trying to close these networks down. Here's a list of the people we've arrested. Here's a list of 30 more people we think are in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the moment. Here are their names, and here are where we think are their domiciles. Arrest them quickly. We will do what we can to help. Here's all the information we have about the involvement of our own secret service, our own military intelligence. I've arrested Mr. Dimitrievich. He's in jail, and so on. He could have behaved in a sort of good neighborly manner. Now, the fact that he didn't doesn't mean he was a warmonger or a hothead or a provocateur. It's simply that he didn't feel able to take that position against the extremists of the pan-Serbian movement. Now, there are several reasons why he didn't, and historians of the region are puzzled over this. One reason is that they were actually very powerful. The networks of the Black Hand were very powerful. They controlled a substantial part of the officer corps. They had hollowed out a large part of the customs administration, the border force, especially along the border with Austria-Hungary. So they were a power to be reckoned with, and it was no light thing, no small thing to challenge them openly. But more important, I think, is the fact that the relationship between Pasich and the Black Hand was a little bit like the relationship between Sinn Féin and IRA. I mean, the Black Hand were doing these acts, which Pasich did not actually, strictly speaking, approve of, but he could not disavow the movement. He could not disavow the ideology in whose name these acts were being planned and carried out, because he himself was an exponent of that ideology. The ideology of the creation of a larger, unified Serbian homeland, as he would call it, including people we may not regard as Serbs, but who were seen as Serbs by those who expounded this vision. So, and I don't want to suggest that the Serbs are unique in this respect. They are simply doing what Europeans did in the 19th century, which is, by violence if necessary, to establish a national homeland. The Italians did it, the Germans did it. That's how many European nation-states have been built. But that meant the Serbs could not give the Austrians satisfaction. So we have already there a kind of sclerosis in the system. The elasticity is gone. Why don't the Germans simply let the Austrians sit and deal with this on their own? Because the Germans don't have any other allies. They've got Italy, but we've already seen that Italy is a purely nominal ally. In fact, it's even less than that. It's really a sort of theoretical enemy, because it signed secret pacts with France, among other things. So the Italians certainly cannot be counted on. One has to ask oneself how realistic it is to expect Berlin simply to leave Vienna in the lurch when this request for help comes. Now, in retrospect, of course, we wish the Germans had. It would have been marvelous if we had such philosophical instincts reigning in Berlin that they could have said, you know, a great conflagration is in sight, we don't want to take that risk, we'll let our allies drop. But no, they thought of the nearer and the closer argument before they considered the larger and more distant but more terrible danger. And in that, they had that in common with all the decision makers of the summer of 1914.
Professor Clarke, believe it or not, my name is Christopher Clarke.
Welcome to this gathering. There are so many, we're a great and numerous tribe.
Let me ask my question and I'll give you the background. The question is, do you think it's possible that we could be sleepwalking towards another catastrophe? And let me give you the background. In your book, you try to absorb some of it.
I hope so too.
I have to say the first 100 pages on Serbia was quite hard work. You put a lot of emphasis on the fact that various things that had happened in the last 30 or 40 years, maybe 50 years, leading up to 1914.
Yeah.
The two Serbian wars, the Franco-Prussian War, and essentially you explore very carefully this whole question of the recognition that there was a need to find a new balance of power. And this whole question of balance of power comes up time and time again, and hence the need to look for this alliance or that alliance and so on and so forth. You also draw out the lack of understanding or suspicion, call it what you will, in all sorts of areas. I mean, arguably Britain, as you put it, was about as remote from understanding France, never mind lots of the rest of Europe, in 1914 than some might argue it is today. Now, if you roll that forward, and perhaps I should just add to that, the lack of understanding of Russia. If you roll that forward to what you were saying about what may have happened since the end of the Cold War, where the balance of power, which appeared to be kind of understandable, has changed very dramatically. And in the more recent years, since the economic crisis, all sorts of fault lines are developing. Now, until quite recently, those appeared in Europe, and you stressed it was Europe. Those fault lines, until recently, were really being referred to as economic fault lines. But increasingly, we're seeing political fault lines develop, on top of which there are all sorts of 19th century structures where parts of countries, whether it's in Spain or Italy or whatever, don't really feel part of that country. So, I just wonder whether we could be sleepwalking in the same kind of way.
Well, I think there's something in what you say that the EU feels like as an entity seems less cohesive in some ways because of the pressures of the financial crisis that you've been talking about. The fact that as a kind of community of experience, it's stretched really to breaking point because the current experience of being a European is just now so different and so polarized economically and socially in terms of expectations. That's a dangerous development. I think that there's a certain amount of danger built into the multiplicity of agencies who've been able to make policy in the last 10 or 20 years. If we think about what seems to be the somewhat slightly geopolitically naive approaches made to Kiev, for example, by the EU, the rather unresolved and difficult to read relationship between NATO and the EU as actors on the international stage, that these are all, one could argue, sort of all danger signs or areas of potential risk. But on the other hand, it seems to me, I must say, I'm not particularly, pessimistic about this particular crisis because it seems to me that there are several differences. One is that the style of international politics is totally different from 1914. The kind of what Clarke might call the autism of the actors of 1914, this inability to put oneself in the position of the opponent, to see the world from the opponent's point of view, which is common to all the decision makers in 1914. I don't think that's really a property of most of the decision makers now. It may be the case of Vladimir Putin, but I don't think it's the case of the Western actors in this current standoff. I think that another point worth making is that the whole style, the kind of cool, rather restrained style of international politics, of rhetoric today, has no counterpart in 1914. The sort of bellicose, belligerent raging. You still hear it in the media, Fox TV and so on in particular, but you don't find that in the mouths of the statesmen. So it's very restrained language, a tendency to self-critique. We've got this and that wrong. We've got to try and do this better. You think of the statements coming from Walter Steinmeier and Angela Merkel, very restrained, very carefully calibrated to the situation, trying to avoid unnecessary escalations. And then there's the fact that we have a range of measures, in the form of sanctions of varying intensity and so on, available to statesmen, which simply weren't there in 1914. And finally, two last things: the fact that there are still, many. The architecture of communication between Russia and its Western partners is actually very robust and has many, many layers. And Russians and politically important Russians and politically important European counterparts, Western European counterparts, are talking to each other in all kinds of different contexts. There are many bodies which represent the Russians as well as the rest of Europe, the EU, and we mustn't overlook that. It's a far more mediated environment than, for example, we see in the West Pacific, where you really do have just a sort of naked clash of self-interest versus self-interest. And one last point about 1914. One of the dangerous things about 1914 was a kind of equilibrium between the two alliance blocs. The fact which meant that on both sides you could believe it might be possible to prevail over the others. On the other hand, there was also reason to fear that if you didn't act fast, you might drift into permanent inferiority. That's not really the case today. It's not an equilibrium. I mean, the West is strong, and although Russia is rearming and getting stronger, Putin's policy is not a policy of strength, and that sort of equilibrium situation doesn't prevail. So the West can afford to take things slowly and cautiously, and I think that's by and large what the Western policymakers have been doing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have to bring the discussion to a close at this point, with great regret. After an evening like this, there are many things one can say. I will suffice with one observation, and that is simply that in surveying historical writing, rarely is deep scholarship so profoundly animated by a sense of humanity as one finds it in the writings of Christopher Clarke. And I think there's no historian who reminds us so effectively that even in the deepest of human tragedies, human comedy is we see peeking through. Ladies and gentlemen, let us express our appreciation for Professor Clarke's lecture.